There is a kind of pain that does not make you weaker. It finds the deepest part of you, grabs hold of everything you were too afraid to feel, and turns it into something the whole world can hear. Otis Redding Sr. spent his Sundays telling his congregation that God had a plan and spent the rest of the week drowning in his own lungs, too sick to work, too proud to quit. And his son watched every single second of it, said nothing, picked up a microphone and screamed it all out so loud that 50,000 strangers in California wept for a man they had never met. The town of Dawson, Georgia, in 1941 was not the kind of place that produced legends. It was the kind of place that swallowed them whole before they ever got the chance to become anything at all. The roads were red clay. The fields were white with cotton. And the people who worked those fields were black men and women whose grandparents had been enslaved on the very same soil, whose names had been changed and whose histories had been buried so deep that even the people who lived them stopped trying to dig them back up. Into this world, on the 9th of September 1941, Otis Ray Redding Jr. was born. His father, Otis Redding Sr., was a man who carried two lives inside him at the same time and never once complained about the weight of either one. On Sunday mornings, he stood at the pulpit of the Vineville Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, and told his congregation about grace and purpose and the promise of a God who saw every sparrow that fell. His voice was steady then. His hands were still. He believed every word he said. Jen and the people in those pews believed him because a man who has suffered the way Otis Sr. has suffered does not speak about faith as an idea. He speaks about it as the only thing standing between him and the dark. But from Monday through Saturday, Otis Sr. was a laborer. He worked whatever job he could find in a country that had decided long before he was born exactly how much a black man's body was worth and exactly how far a black man's ambition was allowed to reach. He hauled bricks, he cleaned floors. He worked the kind of jobs that leave marks on a body that never fully heal. And somewhere in the years between the preaching and the laboring, his lungs began to betray him. Tuberculosis was not a quiet disease. It did not give you the dignity of suffering in private. It announced itself every single morning with a cough that sounded like something tearing from the inside, a wet and ragged and relentless sound that moved through the thin walls of their home in Tyndall Heights, the public housing project in Macon where the family had settled. And that sound filled every room and settled into the bones of everyone who heard it. Otis Jr. heard it every day. He was a child the first time he understood what that sound meant. He was still a child when he understood that it was getting worse. And he was 15 years old when he understood that understanding it was not enough anymore. The family had 6 children to feed. Otis Sr. preached when he was well enough to stand at a pulpit. His wife, Fannie Mae, sold Avon products door to door in a neighborhood where most people could not afford the things she was selling, and she worked every shift she could find because the alternative was unthinkable. And young Otis, the fourth of those 6 children, sat in the classrooms of Ballard Hudson High School in Macon and tried to concentrate on lessons while the arithmetic of his family's survival played out in the back of his mind every single minute of every single day. He was not a careless student. He was not a boy who did not care about his future. He was a boy who understood his present more clearly than most adults understand anything. And what his present was telling him was that someone had to do something before the whole thing came apart. He dropped out of school at 15. He took every job a black teenager in Macon could find. Or he dug wells in the Georgia heat until his hands bled. He pumped gas on the highway. He worked as a roofer and hauled whatever needed hauling and came home at the end of every day with an exhaustion that should have silenced everything inside him. But it did not. Because every single night, no matter how broken his body felt, Otis Redding Jr. sang. He sang on the front porch while the neighborhood went quiet around him. He sang walking to work before the sun came up over the red clay roads. He sang in the Vinefield Baptist Church on Sunday mornings, standing in the same building where his father preached, filling the same air with a different kind of testimony. Not about scripture, about everything he had seen and felt and swallowed down and never said out loud, and about a man who coughed through the walls every morning and still put on his suit and went to that pulpit on Sunday and told people not to lose hope, about what it costs a boy to watch something like that and be unable to do anything about it except carry it. At the Douglas Theater in Macon, there was a weekly talent show. $5 for the winner. $5 was the difference between eating and not eating. Otis entered and won. He came back the next week and won again. He entered 15 consecutive weeks and won every single time, until the organizers sat him down and told him, with a mixture of respect and exasperation, that he needed to stop competing because it was not fair to give other people the impression that they had a chance. 15 weeks, $75, and something more valuable than the money, and which was the absolute and unshakable certainty that what lived inside his chest was real, that it was bigger than Macon and bigger than Georgia and bigger than any room he had ever stood in, and that the world was going to have to deal with it eventually, whether it was ready or not. The moment that changed everything arrived in October of 1962 inside a converted movie theater on East McLemore Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. The building belonged to Stax Records, a small independent label that was quietly doing something revolutionary, putting black and white musicians in the same room and letting them play together and trusting that whatever came out of that collision was worth recording. Otis had not gone there as an artist. He had gone there as a driver. So he was hauling guitarist Johnny Jenkins to a recording session because Jenkins did not have a license. The session went badly. There was studio time left over at the end, and someone in the room, almost as a second thought, looked at Otis sitting in the corner and asked if he wanted to try something. Otis walked to the microphone. He sang a song he had written himself called These Arms of Mine. It was a ballad, slow and aching, and stripped of everything except the truth of what it felt like to reach for someone and come up empty. His voice cracked on the very first note, not from nerves, from something that had been building inside him since the first morning he heard his father coughing through the wall in Tyndall Heights. Jim Stewart, the owner of Stax Records, sat in the control room and listened and did not move. When Otis finished, the studio was so quiet that you could hear the reel turning on the tape machine. Jim Stewart signed Otis Redding before the day was over. What followed was 5 years of music that redefined what the human voice was capable of expressing. Pain in my heart, Mr. Pitiful, I have been loving you too long. Respect, the song Otis wrote as a man's desperate plea for recognition from the woman he loved, the song that Aretha Franklin would later transform into something else entirely. Try a little tenderness. Performance so physically overwhelming that audiences could not remain in their seats. Otis did not sing these songs the way other performers sang their songs. He did not interpret them from the outside. He excavated them from somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary human emotion. From the place where his father's tuberculosis lived, where the red clay roads of Georgia lived, where the 15-week talent show and the dropped-out school and the dug wells and the pumped gas all lived together in a tangle of grief and love and pride and fury that had never been allowed to surface until he opened his mouth and let it come. On the 17th of June, 1967, Otis Redding walked onto a stage at the Monterey International Pop Festival in Monterey, California, in front of 50,000 people who had spent 3 days watching rock bands and who had, for the most part, never heard his name. He was wearing a lime green suit. His band was locked and ready behind him. And what happened in the next 20 minutes was not a performance in any sense that the word usually carries. It was a reckoning. It was a sharecropper's grandson standing on a stage in California and giving 50,000 strangers everything that Otis Redding Sr. had never been allowed to say from any pulpit in Georgia. The grief of a man who kept preaching even as his lungs failed. The dignity of a woman selling door to door in a neighborhood that had nothing. The rage of a boy who dug holes in the earth at 15 so that the people he loved could eat. All of it came up through the microphone. All of it landed in the chests of people who had come expecting rock music and received something they did not have a word for. When Otis finished, 50,000 people stood on their feet, screamed and wept and grabbed the strangers beside them, because what they had just heard was not entertainment. It was the sound of a life lived all the way to its edges, poured out completely, offered without reservation to anyone willing to receive it. Otis Redding Sr. never made it to Monterey. He died before his son conquered California, before the world learned the name he had passed down. But every note Otis Jr. ever sang carried the echo of those Sunday sermons and those weekday coughs moving through the walls of Tyndall Heights. He did not inherit his father's lungs. He inherited something far more powerful. He inherited his father's belief that pain, spoken honestly enough and completely enough, does not stay pain. It becomes something holy. If this story reached something inside you, if you heard in Otis Redding's voice some things you could not quite name but recognized immediately, so you subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the hardest lives sometimes produce the most extraordinary art. Leave a comment below and tell us whose pain shaped the person you are today. Ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the voices that changed this world forever and the lives behind them that made those voices possible.